The Omega girl had always known that her life was different, not because she chose it to be, but because every single day she woke up to the heavy reminder that she was the lowest in her pack, the unwanted shadow that lingered at the edges of their grand halls, their bonfires, their laughter, always watching but never belonging, forced into servitude from the moment she was old enough to carry buckets of water or scrub the dirt from stone floors, her hands always raw, her knees bruised, her heart quietly breaking as cruel words were flung at her like stones. Worthless, unwanted, weak. Those were the titles they carved into her soul, and still, in the hollow places of her chest, she refused to let her spirit die, finding small fragments of light in secret moments when she would sneak food to the poor, tend to the injured outcasts, hold the hands of the forgotten pups, or bring blankets to those who shivered in silence. And though the pack despised her, those she served gave her fleeting smiles that stitched pieces of hope back into her heart, because helping others was the only thing that made her feel alive, the only thing that made her feel like she had a purpose. And yet, beneath the surface of her quiet strength, there was a girl who dreamed of more, who longed to be loved, not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a woman, a mate, a soul worth keeping. And in the lonely hours, she would close her eyes and imagine arms wrapping around her, a voice calling her beautiful, a life where she was no longer the despised Omega, but the cherished Luna of someone who saw her worth. And in those fragile dreams, a face had already taken shape, the face of a kind warrior from her pack, who had treated her with something resembling kindness, not much, not boldly, but enough to spark warmth in her chest. He would smile at her when no one else did, sometimes slip her food when she had none, once even shielded her from a cruel taunt by saying she deserved respect, and though small, those gestures had been oceans to her parched soul, and in her secret heart she believed perhaps he was the one. Perhaps love was not an illusion. Perhaps fate had not forgotten her after all, so she clung to him with quiet devotion, never daring to ask for promises, but treasuring the hope that glimmered whenever his eyes met hers. Until one night, as the fire crackled in the gathering hall and laughter rose around them, he leaned close, his voice so soft only she could hear, words that seared themselves into her trembling heart. "Trust me, I'll never betray you." And then, as if sealing her fragile hope into something eternal, he brushed his hand against hers and whispered with certainty that at the coming mating ceremony, before the eyes of the pack that scorned her, he would choose her. The morning of the mating ceremony rose bright and sharp, sunlight spilling across the forest as if the heavens themselves had come to watch. Yet in her heart it felt like the sky mocked her, its beauty cruel against the weight she carried. For this was the day when choices would be made, bonds sealed, fates tied together before the eyes of the pack. And though for most wolves it was a celebration of destiny, for her it was a battlefield of hope and dread, her chest heavy with the memory of his promise, the fragile words she had repeated in whispers to herself since the night he spoke them. "Trust me, I'll never betray you." And she had believed, oh how she had believed, because belief was all she had. Belief was the single flame she clutched in the endless cold of her existence. So as she dressed in the plain gown she had mended herself with trembling hands, her fingers lingering on the frayed edges as though trying to will it into silk, she told herself that it did not matter, that he would see her, not the gown, not the scorn, not the Omega curse that clung to her like a scar. He would see her heart, the way she had seen his kindness when no one else did, and that would be enough. Or so she prayed, walking slowly into the courtyard where the pack had gathered in a storm of laughter and color, their bodies adorned in fine fabrics, jewels glittering against skin, their voices loud with excitement, but when they saw her their smiles twisted into sneers, their whispers sharp and deliberate. Why is she even here? Does she not know she is unwanted? She thinks someone will claim her? and every word sank like stones, but she did not let them bury her, because in her chest, beneath the tremble of her ribs, she held his promise like a shield, repeating it in rhythm with her footsteps. Trust me, I'll never betray you. Trust me, I'll never betray you. As though the chant could drown out the cruelty hurled her way, and when she took her place at the edge of the circle, her eyes found him, the warrior she had given her fragile hope to, and he was beautiful in the light of day, his broad shoulders straight, his expression calm, his stance proud, and for a moment she felt the air catch in her lungs because she thought she saw it. The flicker of recognition, the unspoken bond between them that no one else knew of. And her lips parted in a trembling smile, just a small one, because she was not foolish enough to draw attention. But her heart surged like a wave ready to crash, believing that this was her moment, her salvation, her proof that even the lowest Omega could be chosen, could be loved, could be seen. And then the ceremony began. The Alpha's deep voice carrying through the crowd, commanding silence as names were called, as choices were declared, one after another until her pulse pounded in her ears, until she felt dizzy with the weight of anticipation, because his name was called at last, the name that had been her secret prayer, and time seemed to still, the air around her thick, her knees trembling as though her body, already key, knew what her soul refused to believe. And she waited, her chest rising, her eyes searching his face, ready to step forward when he called, ready to claim the promise made in whispers, ready to hold on to the fragile hope she had woven into her very being. But then it happened. Then the shattering came, sharp and merciless, for his hand did not extend toward her. His eyes did not meet hers. There was no recognition in his stance, no flicker of warmth, no hint of the promise he had given. Instead, he turned with an ease that tore through her, a boldness that left her gasping, and he reached for another, his fingers closing around a hand that was not hers, his lips curving into a smile that the pack erupted to cheer, and in that instant her body froze, her breath caught, her soul seemed to be ripped from her chest. Because it was not just rejection, it was betrayal, the deepest kind, the cruelest kind. For he had made her believe, he had whispered hope into her emptiness, and now he had crushed it before the eyes of all, the crowd roaring with laughter, delight at her pain shimmering in every mocking glance, and her heart, her fragile, trembling heart, collapsed into silence as though it had forgotten how to beat at all. The laughter of the pack rose like fire crackling through dry wood, merciless and loud, wrapping around her like chains, every cruel word tossed at her with delight, as if her humiliation was the entertainment they had all been waiting for. Some clutched their stomachs as they laughed. Others pointed at her trembling figure, voices hissing with venom. She thought he would choose her. Even betrayal would not have her. She is less than nothing. And though her chest burned, though her throat ached with the force of unshed tears, she refused to let them see her crumble, for something inside her, something wounded and raw, began to harden like stone beneath the weight of their scorn. And she realized in that searing instant that love was a lie, promises were weapons, and hope was only a tool used to break the weak. She straightened her back, though. Her legs quivered. She lifted her chin, though her heart lay shattered in pieces, and in a voice that trembled at first, but grew steady with each word, she spoke out over the mocking crowd, cutting through their jeers like a fragile blade. From this day, my heart belongs only to the poor, not to love. And the air stilled for a breath, the courtyard silenced, not out of respect, but out of shock that the despised Omega had dared to speak with such conviction. And then came the laughter again, harsher than before, echoing like thunder against the stones. Yet she did not falter, because the words she had spoken were not for them, not for the pack that had mocked her since birth, but for herself. A vow carved into the ruins of her trust, a vow that from now on she would give her heart not to foolish dreams, but to those who needed her strength, the hungry, the broken, the forgotten who, like her, lived in the shadows of cruelty. and as she turned from the circle, her hands clenched at her sides, her pulse steadying with each step she took away from the warriors and the girls in silks, away from the crowd that had stripped her of dignity yet again. She did not see the figure who lingered just beyond the torchlight, wrapped in tattered cloth, his hair unkempt, his face streaked with the dirt of disguise, a beggar to all eyes that glanced past him. But within those eyes was not scorn, not laughter, but something far deeper, a silence heavy with thought, a gaze locked only on her. And as he watched her retreat into the darkness, the sound of her vow still hanging in the night air, his lips pressed together in a secret that none around him could know, and though he remained still, unnoticed, hidden among the shadows, his heart carried her words, turning them over like sacred fire, for he had seen the moment of her breaking and her rise. He had seen her strength forged in the he, and of betrayal, and though she did not know he was there, did not know his eyes followed her, he whispered softly into the night, so faint that even the howling wind could barely catch it, words meant only for himself, words that hinted at the storm yet to come, and then he fell silent again, the beggar cloaked in dust and secrecy, waiting, watching, unseen, while she walked away believing herself alone. The vow still echoed inside her, sharp and cold, yet steady, and she carried it with the heavy grace of someone who had lost too much to hope, her steps dragging her away from the circle that had once promised her love, and now left her nothing but scars, while in the shadows a figure lingered, cloaked in rags, head bowed low, as if he were no more than a beggar, but inside him lived storms that could topple empires. The Alpha King himself disguised, wrapped in dirt and weariness to hide the fire of his blood, for he had come into these lands not to be greeted with bows or trembling respect, but to see the truth of their hearts when they thought no throne was watching. He wanted to know what this pack was beneath ceremony, beneath empty oaths of loyalty, beneath the polished mask of obedience they showed when power looked their way. So he shed his crown and wore the weight of hunger instead, testing them with the fragility of his disguise. And the test began sooner than he expected. The moment his bare feet touched the courtyard stones, he felt eyes crawling over him, not with pity, but with disdain, as though even his shadow were an offense. A boy threw a pebble at his back and laughed when it struck. A woman sneered, clutching her child closer, not from fear but disgust, muttering that he smelled of the alleys. A guard with broad shoulders stepped forward, lips curled, and spat at his feet. He asked only for a scrap of bread, his voice low, careful, and the laughter it summoned was sharp enough to cut. "Beg elsewhere," the guard mocked. "We do not feed rats in this pack." Another joined, shoving him hard so he stumbled, and when he dared to meet their gaze, his dark eyes hidden beneath grime, a hand struck him across the face. The slap cracked through the air, drawing a round of chuckles, as though pain were a performance and his humiliation the entertainment of the hour. His cheek stung, his body rocked, but he did not lift his hand in return, though strength coiled in his bones and his wolf raged within, for he had come not to fight but to witness, to collect the evidence of cruelty with every insult they hurled. They mocked his torn cloak, his unshaven jaw, the dirt that streaked his skin, never once guessing that the man they scorned could crush them all with a single command. He bore it, as he had sworn he would, silent and steady beneath the weight of their cruelty. But in his silence, he saw clearer than ever the truth he had suspected. This pack, fat with arrogance, reveled in trampling the weak, delighted in reminding those beneath them of their worthlessness. And still the crowd swelled with jeers, voices dripping poison, until at last another figure stepped into the noise. Small, slight, her frame trembling but her will unbroken, she cut through the sea of bodies to stand before him. Her hair was tangled, her face pale with exhaustion, yet her eyes burned with the stubborn light of mercy, the same light that had once made her kneel for outcasts, the same light that betrayal could not snuff out. She lifted her voice, soft but firm, telling them to stop, telling them he was no harm to them, that he needed no fists, no stones, only compassion. and when her words were met with louder scoffs, she did not move aside, but planted herself between the beggar and the crowd, her body a shield, though her own life had never been given such protection. The Alpha King, hidden still in rags, felt something strike him harder than the slap of the guard, her defense, her willingness to stand for him when no one else dared, and though, he kept his head bowed. His chest swelled with a pulse of something raw, something dangerous, for in her eyes he saw no disgust, no cruelty, only the reflection of his own humanity. The mercy he had almost forgotten could exist in this world, and in that moment, for the first time, he knew she was not like the rest, not like the wolves who had bathed in cruelty, not like those who mocked suffering as though it were sport. She, broken and betrayed though she was, still chose kindness. She, despised and rejected, still gave shelter with her small defiance. And he, though Alpha King, though master of countless warriors, found himself humbled by the courage of a single hated Omega. The crowd did not quiet when she stood. Instead, their mocking turned sharper, their words cutting her as though standing for a beggar proved what they always claimed, that she was soft, that she was weak, that she belonged only at the bottom. But she bore it in silence, her shoulders drawn back, her chin trembling yet lifted, for in her heart she remembered every night she had gone hungry, every time she had been cast aside, and she knew what it was to be treated as less than nothing. So how could she turn away now from another soul branded the same, even if he were clothed in rags and smelled of the street? She bent, steadying him as he swayed from the shove, her hand hovering near his arm, not caring that her touch would earn her more laughter, not caring that tomorrow her body might ache from the punishments they'd invent, for in that moment mercy weighed more than fear. "He has no food," she murmured, her voice trembling but firm enough to cut through the noise. "Must cruelty be all we offer?" The words slipped from her lips like a plea, but also a quiet rebuke, and some shifted uncomfortably, though most sneered. The guard who had struck him barked a laugh, swearing that the Omega had fallen. And hair made in the trash, the insult sharp enough to sting her already wounded heart, but she did not flinch, only guided the beggar toward a wall, offering him what little dignity she could restore. He watched her, his eyes shadowed, his breath slow, and though he spoke no thanks, she felt something unspoken press between them, something she could not name. Hours bled into the evening, and the pack carried on with their cruel amusement, tossing words, sometimes stones, but she stood like a barrier, refusing to let him fall alone, until at last the crowd tired of the game and drifted back to their preparations, leaving the yard heavy with silence. The stars began to prick the sky, soft light falling on the dirt, and the Omega sat near him, her dress torn at the hem, her hands clasped as though to hold herself together, her heart still a storm from the betrayal she had endured earlier. He leaned back against the rough wall, the sting of the slap lingering, but his mind was not on his pain, it was on her. In her face he saw more than defiance. He saw the fragility of a soul scarred but unbroken, a resilience that made him forget the hunger in his disguise. The silence stretched, broken only by the far-off howl of wolves greeting the night, and she spoke softly, not to him, but to the darkness, saying that she had nothing left to give, but still she would give to those who had less, and the words rooted deep in him, deeper than she would ever know. He turned his face slightly, watching her from beneath the hood of his rags, his chest aching with something he had not felt in years, something between sorrow and awe. And then, when her eyes drifted closed for just a moment, weary with the weight of the day, he let the mask slip, not in sight, but in sound, whispering so low it was almost swallowed by the night air, words that carried the fire of truth, though she did not hear them. "If only you knew who I truly am." The whisper he breathed into the night dissolved into silence, unheard by the Omega whose head rested lightly against the wall, her lashes heavy with exhaustion. Yet the stars seemed to carry the secret above them, a truth waiting to strike at the right moment. and before long the first light of dawn cracked the sky, spilling pale gold across the packlands, stirring life and noise. For this was no ordinary day. It was the day of the mating ceremony, the grand spectacle they dressed in importance, though it often reeked of cruelty for those at the bottom, and for her, the Omega who still bore the sting of betrayal upon her heart, the morning carried only dread. She woke to the clamor of drums and voices, to the sight of wolves moving with giddy excitement, their garments polished, their laughter echoing, and she felt small, as though her body were swallowed by a world designed to remind her of her place. She walked with her eyes lowered, trying to steady the storm inside. For every step toward the ceremonial grounds was another step toward humiliation, and though she whispered to herself that she no longer cared for love, the wounds of last night's betrayal throbbed raw beneath her skin, making her heartbeat stumble as if bracing for another strike. Around her, pack members jeered softly, nudging one another, whispering that today she would stand unclaimed again. Today she would be the laughingstock they expected her to be, and their sneers pressed down like shackles. But still she moved forward, her spine fragile yet unbroken. The grounds were lit with lanterns and strewn with garlands of flowers, beauty arranged as a mask to cover the cruelty simmering beneath, and at the center stood the platform where choices would be made, where fates would be sealed, and where hearts like hers would be shattered without care. Her breath caught as she stepped closer, her mind filling with the memory of a promise whispered not long ago, a promise already broken, and she clutched at her chest as if to cage the ache before it spilled too visibly from her. Then, amidst the glitter of the crowd, a commotion stirred at the edge, sharp and jarring, as guards dragged forward a ragged figure, half stumbling, half pulled, his cloak torn wider, his face shadowed but visible, and laughter rose like wildfire. They mocked the beggar, declaring that even the ground beneath him was too fine, that he was not fit for a servant's shadow, let alone a mate, and some shouted that bringing him to the sacred grounds was an insult in itself. The jeers thickened, filling the air with poison, and she froze as her gaze fell on him, the man she had shielded in the courtyard, the man who had borne their cruelty in silence, now paraded before all as a joke, a spectacle for their delight. Her breath hitched, a tremor running through her body, for she knew this scene too well, the sting of being treated as though unworthy of even existing. But this time, she was not the one standing alone in the circle of scorn. Her hands clenched, her mind warring between fear of more humiliation and the quiet fire of mercy that still lived in her, despite all she had lost. And though her knees quaked, she found herself stepping forward, every eye snapping to her as though she had just confirmed the mockery they expected. The pack roared with laughter, louder than before, tossing cruel words that she was proving her place by siding with filth, that she had finally found someone low enough to claim her, but the sound blurred, fading like distant thunder as she moved closer to him, the ragged figure whose dark eyes held both weariness and storms. She reached him, the circle of wolves parting with sneers, and before her courage could shatter, she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close in defiance of every laugh, every sneer, every wound etched into her heart, her voice carrying steady, though her body trembled. "He's poor," she said, her tone cutting through the chaos, "but he is still worthy of kindness." The silence that followed her words was jagged, fragile, as though the entire courtyard had been struck still by the audacity of her embrace. And then the roar came, louder, harsher, fueled by disbelief and ridicule, voices layering one upon the other until the air itself shook with mockery. For to them it was not mercy they saw, but proof of her shame, proof that the Omega girl was so unwanted, so unworthy, that even a beggar had become her desperate refuge, and they spat their laughter like venom. Some clutched their stomachs as though the sight itself were comedy. Others hurled curses, declaring she had stained the sanctity of the ceremony. But still she held him, her arms firm despite the quiver in her body, her cheek pressed lightly against the dirt-stained fabric of his cloak. Not for love, not for some imagined claim, but because her heart refused to let another soul be trampled as she had been trampled. The beggar's body stiffened beneath her touch, his breath uneven, for though he had weathered blows, endured slaps, and borne ridicule in silence, nothing pierced him more deeply than this act. This simple mercy wrapped around him like fragile armor, for it was a kindness he had not expected and perhaps did not deserve in the eyes of her pack. He lifted his head slightly, shadows veiling his expression, yet within his chest something wild stirred, a mixture of fury at their cruelty and awe at her defiance, and though he said nothing, the storm in his silence grew. Around them, the alpha and beta wolves laughed hardest, scoffing that this was fitting, that the lowest of their pack had chosen a mate lower still, a nothing clinging to nothing, and their voices whipped the crowd into a frenzy of jeers. But she did not loosen her hold, her heart pounding as she whispered again, softer now, as though to herself, that kindness cost nothing, that dignity was not measured in gold or rank, that even a beggar deserved to be seen. Her words carried into the air, cutting through the cruelty like faint bells, and too, Homost answered with mockery. There was a sliver of silence threading its way into the noise, a ripple of unease, for even wolves drunk on arrogance could not fully smother the truth in her voice. Still, the humiliation pressed heavy, the ceremony itself stalled by her defiance, and the master of the ritual barked for order, declaring her an embarrassment. Yet her arms did not waver. The beggar lowered his gaze, his lips pressing tight, and inside he fought the urge to reveal himself, to shatter their laughter with the truth of who he was, but he held the fire back, waiting, watching, for the moment to strike. And in that fragile pause, his whisper from the night echoed again in his chest. If only you knew who I truly am, while in her heart the vow she had made to serve only the poor tightened, binding her to her choice. The jeers swelled again, thunderous, furious, demanding she release him, demanding she bow, demanding she accept her place as unworthy of even pity, and yet she clung tighter, her voice ringing out one last time, steady now despite the tears gathering in her eyes. He's poor, but he is still worthy of kindness. And with those words, the cliff of silence returned, sharper this time, and every eye fixed on her as though waiting for the ground itself to break beneath her feet. The silence hung heavier than stone, thick enough to choke the very air, as every pair of eyes remained locked on the Omega, with her arms wrapped around the beggar, their jeers stalled in their throats, their laughter collapsing beneath the weight of disbelief that someone so despised would dare such a defiant act. But before their scorn could rise again, the air shifted, subtle at first like the tremor before a storm, then sharp and undeniable, a pressure rolling out from the man she held, a power so ancient and commanding that even the proudest wolves felt their hearts stutter. He straightened slowly, the slouch of weakness shedding like a discarded skin, his spine uncoiling with the elegance of a predator who had never once bowed, and the ragged cloak that had hidden him seemed suddenly smaller, thinner, unable to contain the blaze of dominance that radiated from within. His eyes lifted, dark and burning, no longer dulled by disguise, but gleaming with the authority of a king, and the crowd gasped, the sound slicing through the silence like 100 knives drawn at once, for they recognized in an instant what their cruelty had blinded them to, the aura of an alpha, not merely any alpha, but the alpha whose name carried both fear and reverence across every territory. The ground itself seemed to bow beneath his presence, and those who had slapped him, shoved him, spit at his feet, now recoiled as though they had struck lightning with bare hands. Whispers turned into a frenzy, voices breaking, struggling to reconcile the image of rags with the truth of the crown, and terror crawled across their faces as they realized their insults had not fallen on a beggar, but on the most powerful alpha alive, the one whose word could dismantle their pack, whose wrath could burn them from history. The Omega staggered back a step, eyes wide, her heart thundering with confusion and disbelief, for the man she had embraced in mercy now stood not as fragile, but unbreakable, cloaked in a storm that made even the strongest warriors shrink. The pack's mocking twisted into fear, their arrogance collapsing, and a tremor of dread rolled through the ceremonial grounds, heavier with each heartbeat as he let his power swell, no longer hidden but unleashed, a tide of dominance that pressed against every chest, forcing even alphas of lesser rank to bow their heads without command. And still he said nothing, only stood taller. Each breath he drew a reminder that the disguise was gone, that their lies, their cruelty, their laughter had been witnessed by the one man whose judgment none could escape. The Omega, her arms now fallen to her sides, stared at him with a storm of emotions too tangled to name: fear, awe, confusion, and the faint flicker of wonder that the soul she had shielded with her fragile defiance had been shielding himself all along. Around them the silence thickened once more, desperate and waiting, as the truth settled like ash after fire. The beggar they had mocked was the Alpha King, and every insult hurled at him had carved their own doom. The crowd quivered beneath the weight of his unveiled power, their earlier bravado dissolving into trembling silence, for every heartbeat reminded them of the enormity of their mistake, and none dared to breathe too loudly lest his gaze fall upon them, a gaze that now burned like fire through the veil of rags that no longer mattered. For what stood before them was not a beggar, but the embodiment of strength and dominance, the Alpha King whose name had been whispered in both fear and reverence beyond their borders. His presence pressed against their wolves, forcing them to bend instinctively, their spines curving under the authority that no oath could deny. And in that forced submission their arrogance cracked, revealing the truth of their cowardice. The warriors who had struck him, the guards who had spat at his feet, now shifted backward, their eyes darting with panic, sweat gathering at their brows as they realized they had raised their hands not to refuse a stranger, but to dishonor a king. The Omegas who had jeered louder than the rest now covered their mouths, faces pale with terror, for cruelty had been their shield, and now cruelty had become their noose. The ceremonial grounds that moments ago rang with laughter now echoed with silence so tense it seemed the earth itself held its breath. And at the center of that silence stood the Omega girl, trembling yet unbroken, her heart racing as her mind tried to grasp the enormity of what had just unfolded, that the man she had defended not for power or favor but for mercy was no beggar at all, but the one wolf whose presence could shatter her entire pack with a single command. Her lips parted, a breath caught, and she lowered. At her gaze, uncertain if her choice to shield him would save her or destroy her. But before fear could consume her, his voice finally broke the silence, low at first, a rumble that carried across the courtyard like distant thunder, then rising until every corner of the grounds vibrated with its force. His words were not many, but each syllable dripped with finality, each sound a decree that none could oppose, and the air itself seemed to bow as he spoke. "This Omega," he declared, his eyes sweeping over the faces that had mocked her, his voice ringing with a power that made even the lanterns tremble in their hooks, "who hugged me will be my queen." The words of his decree still thundered in the air, heavy as iron chains, and for a moment the courtyard was frozen in stunned disbelief, as though no one dared to move lest the weight of his command crush them. But then the silence fractured, splintering into fury as the pack leaders surged forward, their faces twisted with outrage, their voices rising like a storm determined to challenge the sky itself. For to them, his proclamation was not only unthinkable, but humiliating, a stain on their pride that burned hotter than fire. They bared their teeth, some trembling in the presence of his power, yet forcing their rage past their fear, spitting words meant to wound, insisting that an Alpha King should not debase himself with a creature so low, a worthless Omega unfit to stand even among the lowest ranks, let alone beside the throne. Their shouts tumbled over one another, sharp and cruel, echoing through the ceremonial grounds, and each accusation struck her like a lash, every reminder of her supposed worthlessness tightening the noose of shame she had carried all her life. She trembled, not from their scorn alone, but from the storm she felt gathering around him, the way his dominance thickened the air, a silent warning that His patience was thinning, yet still the leaders pressed on, their arrogance swelling in a desperate attempt to mask their fear, declaring that his choice was madness, that if he claimed her, they would not bend, they would not follow, they would rather tear themselves apart in war than bow to a queen of filth. Their threats spilled like venom, poisoning the night, and the crowd stirred with unease, some nodding, others shrinking, the divide splitting wider with every furious word. Her heart pounded, her chest tight, for though she had endured humiliation all her life, never had her presence alone threatened to unravel her pack's fragile pride, never had her existence been the spark for war, and the thought wrapped icy fingers around her lungs. She swallowed hard, her voice small but urgent, breaking through the thunder of shouts as she turned toward him, her lips trembling, her words laced with both fear and sorrow, whispering, "You shouldn't choose me. They'll destroy you." Her plea trembled into the night, fragile as glass, yet it struck him sharper than any blade, and for a heartbeat his blazing eyes softened, a flicker of something tender flashing within the storm. But then the fire returned, brighter, fiercer, as though her doubt only fueled his resolve. The pack's fury still rippled through the air like wildfire, each leader's voice sharpening into a blade meant to pierce his command, their eyes burning with defiance, their threats swelling bolder with every breath. Yet even as their rage filled the night, it could not drown the weight of his silence, for he stood unmoving, shoulders squared, gaze locked on them with the steady fire of a king who had nothing to prove and yet everything to command. And the quiet force of it unsettled even the most defiant, making their bravado falter, though they dared not lower their voices. She clung to the edges of that moment, her pulse racing, for never had she stood so near to the eye of a storm. And though her fear screamed that she was the cause of this chaos, another voice, quieter but insistent, whispered that perhaps she was also its center, the unyielding ground upon which the storm might break. Still, doubt weighed heavy, dragging her gaze to the dirt, shame curling around her heart as the leaders spat their venom, declaring her unworthy, demanding her rejection, and for an instant she wished she could vanish into shadows, that she could undo her hug, erase her presence, free him from this burden. But then she lifted her head and found his eyes on her, eyes that held not scorn, not regret, but an intensity that burned through her fear like sunlight breaking frost. The leaders did not see it, could not feel it, for they were blinded by their arrogance, by the brittle pride that made them mistake their noise for power, yet she saw it clearly, the promise that lived in his gaze, unspoken but undeniable. One leader, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped forward, his voice booming, his words sharpened with defiance as he warned that to crown her would be to crown disgrace itself, and that if the Alpha King persisted, the pack would rise in rebellion, tearing themselves free from his reign, ready to spill blood to preserve their pride. The courtyard erupted, a clash of voices, some cheering the challenge, others shrinking in fear. But he remained still, his dominance coiling tighter, filling every breath of air until silence began to fall again, unforced but inescapable, as though the very earth knew to bow beneath his will. She trembled, caught between terror and awe, as the last of the threats faded into the heavy quiet, her heart drumming against her ribs. And then he finally moved, his voice rising like thunder, a sound that shook through bone and soul alike, steady, unshaken, and burning with a promise that silenced every tongue. Let them try. The moment his thunderous words, "Let them try," cracked through the air, the world seemed to shatter into chaos, for the leaders of her pack, enraged by his defiance, barked orders to their warriors, and within heartbeats the courtyard became a battlefield, growls and snarls colliding with the crash of bodies as the first of the brutes lunged forward, blades flashing, claws unsheathed, every strike aimed at the disguised beggar who was no beggar at all, but the Alpha King. Yet instead of faltering beneath their numbers, he moved with terrifying grace, each motion a storm-given flesh, his fists striking like iron, his claws tearing through arrogance, his dominance rippling outward until even the stones seemed to quake beneath his wrath. And though they came at him again and again, thinking numbers would drown him, he remained unbroken, blood dripping from wounds, yet power blazing hotter with every strike, while she stood frozen, her heart splitting in two as she watched the man she had hugged, her only act of kindness, unleash destruction upon the pack she once longed to belong to. She ran forward, voice raw with desperation, begging them to stop, pleading with him to relent, but her cries drowned in the roar of violence, her small figure swept aside by the tide of fury, her tears unnoticed as the ground drank crimson, and horror twisted in her chest. For though she had been despised, though she had been betrayed, she had never wished for this, had never wished to see her people broken beneath one man's hand, and yet there was no stopping it, for the war had already begun. The pack warriors, realizing too late that this beggar was the king of kings, fought harder, their shame fueling their stubbornness. But every strike they landed seemed only to feed the inferno he carried, and still he fought, wounded yet untouchable, bloodied yet relentless, until the courtyard reeked of fear, the laughter of mockery long forgotten, replaced by screams and gasps of men brought to their knees. She fell to the ground, clutching her chest, whispering for the moon to end this madness, her tears mixing with dust. But above her, his voice rose again, fierce and terrible, carrying through the silence too. Hat followed the clash, his body marked with cuts, his breath ragged, his presence unshaken, and with eyes blazing as though he carried the wrath of the heavens themselves, he declared for all to hear, words that seared into the night like fire. If I must burn your pack to ash to claim her, so be it. Silence followed his thunderous vow, silence so thick it pressed against every chest, for in those words lay not just a threat, but a promise of ruin, and the pack that had once laughed now trembled as the weight of their folly became clear, their bravest warriors sprawled broken on the earth, their leaders pale with the knowledge that they had waged war against a storm they could never hope to contain. Yet even as fear coiled in their bellies, pride still clawed at their tongues, urging them to resist. But before they could rise again, his dominance surged outward, vast and unrelenting, a tide of power that bent the air itself, and in that force they finally understood that he was not simply an alpha, but the Alpha King, and no howl of rebellion could stand against him. She stood amidst the ruin, her breath catching, torn between awe and grief, her heart breaking at the blood spilled in her name. Yet even as she trembled, she could not look away from him, this man who had shed disguise and endured insult, this man who stood bloodied but unbowed, claiming her before all. And when his eyes found hers through the smoke and dust, she saw not wrath, but something deeper, a resolve born of fire and tenderness entwined, and it unraveled the walls she had built against love. The leaders at last sank to their knees, voices trembling as they begged forgiveness, their pride crumbling before survival. Yet their pleas mattered little, for he turned from them, dismissing their power as if it had never been real, his gaze fixed only on her, and when he stepped forward, hand outstretched. The crowd parted not from respect, but from terror, leaving a path of silence between them. She whispered through her tears that he should not bear such ruin for her, that she was unworthy, that she was still the hated Omega, but he silenced her doubts with a single look, a look that declared her worth beyond crowns and kingdoms. And when his voice rose again, it was not thunder, but a vow, steady and unbreakable, as he claimed her as his queen, not for her strength nor her beauty, but for the kindness that had moved her to hug a beggar when all others turned away. Gasps rippled through the pack, and though many wept with shame, none dared to speak, for the truth was unshakable. She who had been mocked and beaten, she who had been cast aside, now stood at the side of the greatest alpha alive, not as a servant, not as a plaything, but as his equal, his mate, his chosen queen. And as the moon rose high above the broken ceremony, casting silver light across the courtyard, she felt her heart open again, no longer bound by betrayal, no longer shackled by fear, but free at last to believe. And when his hand clasped hers before the kneeling pack, she lifted her chin with quiet strength, her voice clear as she whispered the vow that bound her fate to his, not in fear, but in choice. And together they stepped into a new life, leaving behind ashes of cruelty, forging a future where love had risen from ruin, where an Omega became queen, and where the pack that once spat on her name bent forever at her feet.